Good evening, everyone. My name is Nancy Davidson, and I'm the chair of the Issaquah Environmental Board. I want to welcome you all to the meeting tonight. Before we get started, I have a few bits of information to share with you. Today is the October 13th, 2021 board meeting. And due to the virtual format of today's meeting, I'd like to start by providing some guidelines. We have participants attending by computer and others who may be attending by phone. For all meeting attendees, please speak clearly and pause frequently. State your name each time before speaking. Mute your microphone when not speaking. If you're having technical issues, try joining the meeting using a different device, such as a smartphone or a tablet, or there's the call-in information in the meeting invite that you can call into the meeting. With that, we'll begin taking attendance and taking the roll call of the commissioners in attendance. Please unmute and say here when Jean calls your name. Go ahead, Jean.
Okay, starting from the top of the list, I don't see Tom Anderson on the call yet. Next is Surya Balapragada.
Here.
And Nancy Davidson.
Here.
Jamie Finch.
Here.
Cameron Fisher.
Yeah.
Rishi Hazra. I don't think Rishi has joined yet. Dan Hintz.
Here.
Danny Madden.
Here.
Okay, and Ann Newcomb.
Here.
And Janet, I don't think Janet has joined yet, but Laura Labico and Don McWilliams had excused absences as well.
Thank you. As a reminder to everyone here, if you have a desire to speak, please send a chat to all participants and type question or comment, and then I will work hard to try and acknowledge you, and if I miss you, someone will remind me, I hope. Please do not put any substantive comments in the chat. For any commissioners that could not join us via this WebEx meeting and are on the phone, we will check in with you intermittently to see if you have any comments. I don't think we've seen anyone yet, have we, Jean? That is not any commissioners that way. You can also press *3 to raise your hands. The next thing on the agenda is, well, before I move on to that, we want to welcome Gene. He is now here to join us. Gene Paul is filling in to kind of lead the environmental board. I understand he's a management analyst with the city of Issaquah, and I think he's in this role in an interim position until Megan's position is fully filled. So we'll welcome him, and we'll try and be nice to you along the way and give it our best shot. So thank you for joining us. With that, our next item on the agenda is the approval of the minutes for September 21st, 2021. Does anyone have any comments or changes that need to be made to that meeting? Seeing no one willing to comment or raise the minutes stand approved. The next agenda topic is public comments. And before we get into public comments, I'm going to provide some guidelines for public comments. Public comments are an important part of the public process. We take them seriously and factor them into the decisions we make. For the members of the public joining us, welcome. If there's anyone in the meeting now who would like to make public comments, please raise your virtual hand. To do this, if you're on the phone, press *3. If you have joined by computer or smartphone, then look for a hand icon. This varies depending upon the device you're using. One option may be to go to the participant panel and select your name, then choose raise hand. It may also be located under the reactions menu or more menu. With that, I'm going to ask Jean to call anyone that is interested in providing public comment for the meeting. Thank you.
And there are 3 members who have raised their hands. Going to move one over to a panelist now. So Ann Fletcher, you should be able to unmute, and if you'd like to share video, you can do so as well.
And just give me a second. When you're recognized, please make sure you unmute your microphone, state your name, address, and relationship to the city, speak clearly and pause frequently for us all. Try and limit your comments to 5 minutes and mute your microphone when you're done. Thanks, Ann. I appreciate it. I forgot to say that.
Great. Thank you, Nancy. Good evening, everyone. My name is Ann Fletcher, and I am a resident of Issaquah and a People for Climate Action member. Really nice to see everybody again. And I would like to thank all of you for considering this important Title 18 update. And also thank the city administration, staff, and consultants for their considerable efforts on this. I am seeing more and more evidence of coordination of the proposals in the reports with the comp plan and the climate action plan. And I think that's great. I really like to encourage that. It provides the connections and the context for the community to understand how this is all going to work together. With regard to the landscape section, I wanted to mention an item that's still under review that I've brought up before, and that is that a separate administrative landscape development document that deals with standards that's separate from but authorized by the Title 18 needs to have an oversight mechanism built into it for revisions so that there is some kind of input or awareness amongst the community members when that gets revised. And then with regarding trees, that's the one I have the most comments about. I think that changing to a tree canopy requirement by zone may have some really good benefits. And I also believe that we need both tree quantity and tree quality kinds of standards. And the big question is, how will this differential regulation by zone ensure the current quality of a strong tree canopy and that it is maintained and enhanced for the health and well-being of our living community? And the second point I want to make on trees is we should not lower standards too much for the urban and suburban areas, especially the built environment that abuts our natural environment. We have a lot of that runs right through our town, creeks, native plants, salmon, and other wildlife. So just because it's an urban area doesn't mean that it's not affecting the natural areas that we are in. We may not be able to count on our current canopy in the surrounding hills if we have to create fire breaks to prevent wildfires. And it may require that other areas and zones have higher requirements, and that's why some flexibility needs to be built into that monitoring and adjusting. And my third point is that so far what I've seen addresses climate resiliency and talks about urban heat islands and planting drought-resistant trees and so on. I would like to see the word sequestration in there more. So mitigation. For example, which trees will survive best and which ones will sequester the most carbon? And I think that should be a big criterion for Title 18. My next point is that having a projected 30-year replacement canopy requirement for development, even if it is successful, will be too late for any near-term climate mitigation efforts. And so this timeline is really not a sufficient improvement in our code. The next point is that variance procedures should be delineated in the Title 18 code to avoid exceptions, which allow high tree removal for what's called reasonable use. Who defines reasonable use when there are large environmental impacts? The code may look great, but the exceptions can make things quite different in reality. And finally, limit the amount allowed for in lieu replacement payments to a tree fund. Instead, strive for shared responsibility and management of trees in our land. provide educational outreach to landowners, and promote land stewardship attitudes and a collaborative spirit. Thank you.
Jean, do you have anyone else? Thank you, Anne. Is anyone else interested in commenting tonight?
Yes, there are 2 more hands raised. I'm going to try and move the next person up to make comments. So I believe the next person is Susan Neville. It's the...
Hello, I'm a phone in. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, this is Susan Neville. I'm a longtime Issaquah resident of about 25 years. And thank you for all gathering and going over this important, I think this is kind of a special request, and I really appreciate it. I've been in meetings for this particular code section about 1.5 times. I think it's a real important area. I think, again, it's a technical area, and it's going to take some time to really work it through for our benefit in the long run. I want to say to Anne, really went through a huge list, and it's great. I love it. I'll quickly just reiterate her landscape code, asking for transparency on that document that will be able to be flexible and make changes as we move forward, which I think is essential, but some type of transparency would be great. On the tree code, I've really been racking my brain around this, trying to understand it. I think it's really complex proposal that I think we're talking about maintaining a tree canopy goal, and that will determine our rate moving forward. But Anne did cover many things I wanted to, which was, the first one was to achieve our canopy goals during a development. They take into consideration 2 aspects: what they're going to retain and plant in 30 years as a canopy goal. And that will not be sufficient, as Anne mentioned, because from day 1 to 30 years, your canopy goal has reduced by the amount that they have removed. Another point was that we're also going to be looking at maybe 5 or 6 or 8 different land use types and lot sizes with different canopy goals for each. Is this the simplest method to use for developers and planners and homeowners? That was one of my other questions. And lastly, I think today we have a false sense of what our tree canopy is. I've heard that it's 51%. I think, I still am not sure if we're using the open space around us that does not belong to Issaquah as that rate of 51% currently. And I really think that needs to be explained a little bit better. And with that, I know you have a lot to cover. And thank you again for going through this and listening to all the community.
Thank you. Thank you, Susan, for your comments. We appreciate them. Jean, anyone else?
Yes, 1 more hand raised. I'll move this person up as a panelist. It's the initial CM that the person can now unmute, and if they'd like to share video, they can do so as well.
Shocking. It's Connie Marsh. So I'm going to +1 on Susan and Anne with an emphasis on the tree canopy presentation or proposal basically being a smack with a heavy hammer, when what we are going to require is way more nuance. To have 20% tree canopy in the Issaquah Highlands, the valley floor, will only exacerbate the situation of creating heat islands. You may have noticed this summer when we had the hot weather, we had huge red blobs right on the Issaquah Highlands. So if you want to continue the big red blobs on the Issaquah Highlands, then this is the pathway to go down. That is exactly what we don't want to have happen. What we want to do is have enough tree canopy and year-round tree canopy to provide the needs of the environment for what trees and only trees and vegetation can do, sprinkled throughout. I don't have a particular problem with our big protected areas having a
Connie, I think we might have lost you. You may have to call in. Can anybody else still hear Connie? Okay, Connie, we lost your video. Do you want to try and get back on, please? We'll wait a minute. Wow. Well, what I propose doing is starting into the agenda topics, because I'm not sure when and if Connie will be able to call in. She also could, instead of just video calling, she could also call in. Have you seen anything from her, Jean?
Nothing new since she joined. There's no message, and nobody else has joined by phone since she started her comments.
Okay. Well, if she does come in, Minnie, are you okay with the concept of perhaps letting her finish her comments, taking a break if Jean kind of signals that she's back? Does that work for you?
Yeah,
Okay.
that'll work.
All right. Well, I'll send her a text because I do have her cell phone once we start the next agenda item, and see if perhaps we can get her back, or else we can also take her comments at the end of the meeting or on this topic. So either of those options work. So with that, I'm going to close out public comments unless Jean has someone else. Do you have anyone else, Jean?
There are a couple other attendees who have not raised their hand, so I guess this is the opportunity for them to either raise their hand, send a chat, or hit *3 for the one call-in user to see if there are any remaining attendees that would like to make public comment. But as of now, no.
Okay, well, I'm going to close this section of public comment, except for Connie Marsh, we still have some time to, if she manages to get back with us. Connie, it looks like you may be back. Are you? Okay, saying nothing, I'm going to move on to the agenda topics. The first agenda topic is regarding Title 18, the Land Use Code update regarding trees, or landscape, trees, open space, and community spaces. And with this, I'm going to turn that presentation over to Minnie. Minnie, thank you for joining us.
Good evening, everyone. Glad to see some of you from the marathon meeting that we had on the natural environment topics. Today, we bring forth to you a smaller agenda with 3 topics. But before we get into it, I want to recognize October is the National Community Planning Month, where we celebrate the role planning plays in creating great communities. And here we are celebrating and talking about trees and open space and landscaping and planning for the future. So appreciate everyone's time spending this evening on these topics today. We covered the wetlands and the streams and the water, all those technical comments and questions on those topics. Today, we plan to cover landscaping, so the trees and open space. So let me take a little bit of time to kind of go over what these 3 different topics are and how the city code is set up in terms of these regulations. So landscaping is a chapter that if someone wants to come in and develop a piece of property with a building that's, 5,000 square feet, or it could be 10,000 square feet, and wants to have, 20 parking spaces. So in addition to all the other codes, the landscaping chapter will determine what kind of perimeter landscaping is needed along the edges of the street, the property. How do we spread out their parking and create how much parking spaces do they have, which then dictate how much landscaping they need to put in their parking stalls. If they have a building that's really a blank wall, how do we use the landscaping to create some of the interest and design? So for the landscaping chapter, the goals are obviously the climate, the urban, all the good ecological benefits that you're going to get from landscaping, but in addition, there are urban design aspects that come into play for the landscaping piece. What type of trees do they have? Is there a diversity species included, and so on? In addition to the trees, what kind of shrubs and the grasses are needed? Do they perform any stormwater filtration function? And so that's the landscaping piece. Then the tree regulations really look at tree retention. How many trees do you have on your property? Can you preserve at least 25%? And what that percentage looks like is something that we need to kind of talk about as we discuss the tree regulations. And if you do have to remove a dead tree or a diseased tree, what does that process look like? So that's the tree chapter. And then we have this open space, community spaces, and those kind of regulations that really look at what's the city's vision for these open spaces. We've adopted the park strategic plan that has a connection required for some trails, where the Mountains to Sound Greenway Trust is, and what that big picture looks like, and how do we implement that when we get a development project on a parcel by parcel basis. So that's our dilemma. We're trying to figure out, this is the vision that the city's adopted. How do we use the Title 18 or the Land Use Code update to ensure that we can get to that vision, and also make sure there aren't any barriers in the code that will prevent the city from achieving that vision. But it can't be done just by the code. There's going to be other elements, the programs, the funding that goes with the other aspects that are not just code related. So that's some of the basics. The other thing I think we want to cover with you before we get into what the topics are, because there was some confusion with the other boards and commissions in terms of what's a goal, what's a policy, and what's a code language. So a goal and a policy lives in your long range planning documents, the comprehensive plan, the strategic plan, the climate action plan that you all are working so hard on. So those will have these goals and policies. So for the trees, the goal right now is preserve 50% of the canopy. You can, through the climate action plan and the goals and policy work that you're doing, you can look at that, what that goal needs to be. So the policy related to that goal could be, you should update your code so that, you can meet this goal. You should have some kind of an urban forestry program. You should have some educational opportunities to raise awareness. You should have some programs to do tree planting. So those are all policies under that goal. Now the code adoption is going to be really very specific and nuanced details that will get you the implementation of some of those goals and policies. For instance, if you have 20 parking stalls, how many trees do you need to plant in that parking island? What is the percentage for tree retention? What's the process for modification of some of these codes? So in one-off situations, any modification should require a public hearing. So it's not that you have a code, but then you grant out modifications that really don't get you that vision. And so on. And, it could mean if you cut down one tree that's 8 inches, you have to plant 4 trees. And that's where we'll get into the nuances of what's the best approach for those replacement ratios, canopy coverage or diameter, how do we measure those, and things like that. So code is going to be your nuanced, really down to the ground implementation tool to get you those visions that you've adopted for the city through the goals and policies in your long-range plans. So with that, I'm going to try and share my screen here to walk you through. Jean, can you make me a presenter?
Jean, before you do that, Connie, I understand is back on. I'd like to complete, before you get into your presentation, is that okay? I'd like her to be able to finish her public comments. Jean, can you bring her back on to?
Sure, let me try and move her back to where she can make her comments.
Thank you. There she is.
Sorry about that. Comcast came out, thought they'd solved the problem, and here we are, blanked out. Anyway, I am going to move on to the open space section. So, let's see, how do I say this? The parks plan has a huge amount of capital investment in order to achieve the vision that the Title 18 update is going to have to support. And there's very little conversation about how we are going to know that we are gaining the vision by how the systems combine. I don't really understand how we know we're going to be making good code unless we can understand how we are going to be able to fund the capital program for the public parks. We have some errors that we know are errors in private parks being built in places where the public has no sense or feel that they can enter. We also have some interesting things with places like Costco, where Costco has public areas where the public cannot go because Costco has decided it wants to be a campus that doesn't allow the public. So we need to know that the code is going to actually do its share in supporting getting us our parks and open space that we need, and that's a conversation that is missing. Parks Board came to a meeting and I think they were stunned by the whole thing, so they didn't have very much to say. I'm hopeful that you all will be able to have more of a conversation about the necessity of having our parks and systems threaded throughout the city and our development areas. I appreciate that. I don't know yet that our staff and the consultants fully understand how important the protection of the environment is to the city and, frankly, to the world. We are looking at the Central Issaquah plan that allowed a lot of the area to be cleared, but the EIS also required that we have no loss of the environment during that process. And so if you keep that in mind when there is conversation about how our more highly developed areas need to be more barren, our Central Issaquah Plan EIS basically has said that is not true and that we have to have these places that were planned in order to offset the impacts to the environment of the Central Issaquah Plan. So I know that might all be jargon too, and I apologize, but thank you for letting me come back and talk to you.
Thank you, Connie. Appreciate you coming back and joining us. Okay, Minnie, I'm going to turn it back over to you so you can continue your presentation. Thank you.
Chair, so Jean, I'm going to try and share my screen now.
Okay, Manny, I just made you a presenter again, so I think you should be able to.
Can you confirm you can see my first slide on a whole screen?
Yes.
So, we want to reserve some time for a conversation. So I'm going to quickly get through this. This was all in your packet, and we've previously covered it under other boards and commissions that some of you may have already watched that meeting. But like I said, there are three topics. So the first one is landscape. And then we have our staff, Daniel Martinez, here today attending, and I'll turn over the presentation over to him. He's going to talk over the tree management aspects of the code. He's the lead staff that will be working on the tree section of the code that seems to have a lot of community interest. And then I'll wrap it up with the discussion about the open space. Like you all know, we do have consultants who are working on this. So Berger is the consultant that worked on the park strategic plan, and they're helping with the landscaping and open space sections of the code. For the tree management, we had engaged Watershed initially. They did the presentation to Planning and Policy Commission, but the the code writing aspects of it are going to be handled by staff. With obviously technical support will support as needed on that. So let's see if I can to the next slide. So the three topics. So for the first topic, I'll cover what's the city's goal, what are some of the gaps that we've identified so far, what is our thinking is at this point for how we are planning to update the section of the code, and then obviously what you all think is missing from the discussion and should be included in the update. Again, like I said, the landscaping, in addition to all the environmental benefits from storing the carbon and providing climate benefits to improving water and air quality, enhancing the habitat, reducing polluted stormwater, recreation, providing shade, and the urban design aspects of it. And frankly, a lot of studies are showing the mental health benefits of good landscapes that bring to the built environment. So we hope to attain all of these as new landscapes come into play. Bear in mind that the code would only apply to new development. Obviously, if someone's landscaping is not being maintained, the code would have provisions for how to enforce it. If they have some dead landscaping and things like that, that would come into play as well. So some of our goals are to make sure that we're coordinating with our street standards. We're looking at different neighborhoods and their unique aspects. Some of that has come out today in terms of, where the heat islands are in the city and how some landscaping requirements in those areas need to be more than others that are in a little bit better shape. How to update our parking lot landscaping standards. Then, of course, coordinating with our parks strategic plan and the green necklace, what type of streets and trail types we need to include to maintain this connected green spaces. And then, of course, there's all those nitty-gritty details that make a difference between how the health of these trees that are planted. What are the details? What are the soil types that are needed? If you're planting trees in very small spaces, what type of best management practices really will give you the best opportunity, and really what that minimum space needs to be for the tree to grow and be healthy for a long haul. And the soil depths, and then of course the procedural aspects. What are the inspections that are required when you're doing the planting? What are some long-term monitoring aspects? How are we managing the tree fund, and how to minimize people being able to pay into the tree fund and really doing the planting, because there's a lot that goes into getting the trees planted and maintained over the long haul. So those are some of our thought process for this update. So creating a citywide baseline standards that apply everywhere, but then also looking at the uniqueness of some streets, the neighborhoods, and filtering those out for those. Right now, our standards are spread out in 5 different locations. For Central Issaquah, you go into a different location. For replacement regulations for Talus and Highlands are in a different section of the code, and so on. So consolidation and those kind of things. And then, of course, number 2 is the more technical details that need to be vetted out. This is something you heard from the community in terms of where they live. Obviously, first we need to figure out what those are, and then of course it'll be easy to kind of say they're embedded in the code, they're referenced in the code, or where they live and what the transparent process for them looks like for any updates, because we don't want to have a very, one size fits all, but also a canned approach that it becomes really hard to amend, because code amendment process has to go through certain process and procedures, but at the same time, we want to be transparent and open about what those standards are, and not have some way of changing what was publicly shared. Some updates to the new trees, right size tree in the right place, what are, all of those things. So, and in our process, we've looked at some other cities. This is our consultants' slides. They talk about Kirkland, Seattle, and Wenatchee. Some of the highlights from those cities include, coordinating the width of the planter based on what type of tree you're planting. What happens with overhead utility lines? The last thing you want is you plant a tree and then it gets topped, which eventually will make the tree die over the long haul. How do we have some requirements that prevent those kind of things from happening? Or if you plant a tree at the street corner that blocks the view, or cars coming in and out, or fire trucks coming in and out, how to avoid some of those things, so that in the end the tree ends up being taken out because it was a problem. How to have soil volume requirements so that the tree is healthy over the long haul. In Wenatchee, I think they talked about shrub heights and parking lot landscaping. So some good things that some folks have figured out. We want to learn from them, but also be unique to what Issaquah's desires are. So that's sort of the nutshell, very high level, sharing with you what we're thinking on the landscaping chapter. So I want to take a pause and have an opportunity to have a discussion on the landscaping, and then we'll get into the tree discussion that will be facilitated by Daniel.
Okay, thank you, Minnie. Are there any comments or questions for Minnie at this point in time from the board? Well, I guess I have one comment. I'll start this off, Minnie. In my experience working in another community, we found that street trees often created an issue with regards to lifting sidewalks and creating trip hazards. And I didn't see that anywhere in your list of things to be considered. And that is another huge liability to the city along the way. So I'm hoping that as you develop your standards, for landscaping and or trees, that you're really thoughtful in terms of that, because it's a very expensive proposition.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. That's a very excellent point. Actually, we've had started the conversations with our streets department, and they have highlighted how much of a problem it is in Issaquah. And it is quite a bit of a problem, because you have smaller planting strips that have these large trees, and over time they're buckling up the sidewalks and all of those. They call it high edges. So some of these standards, silver cells or structural soil requirements, those will be all handled with this code update. It'll apply to the new code. Obviously, going back and retrofitting pre-existing conditions is an issue that the city will have to deal with. And if that means we may end up losing some trees, but the replanting will have to be the right tree and the right spot. What does that mean for the tree canopy coverage goals? I think is part of the conversation. So excellent point. It is an issue that's going to come fair and square in front of this community.
And I would add one more thing to that, Minnie, just as a comment, and that is that typically I have found in my experience having good details of how to plant the trees and what's expected, depths and things like that, and actually having someone look at them before they fill it with dirt, because can prevent some of those challenges and make a more successful tree canopy and a longer living tree. And I'm hoping that, I know that's not a code issue, but as it's passed along, it's something that needs to be done as well, which is if we want to sustain this canopy, we need to actually observe some of these trees going in and not just assume they're, because landscapers know how to do it right? But not necessarily to the standard that we're hoping that will last over a long time. Anyway, just my comments.
Yeah, I know that's again an excellent point. I think we need to do the soil inspections before the plants are planted in, because then we're not going to have them rip them out, at that stage. And so having the codes are only so good as long as they're implemented. So we obviously the implementation of the first step is getting the codes in place. The second step on how we implement them is going to be equally important.
Okay, great. All right, we have a comment from Anne. Anne, go ahead, please.
Thanks, Nancy. Ann Newcomb here. So I'm wondering, Minnie, if we can be looking at what kinds of fertilizers to use, staying away from chemical fertilizers that'll pollute the waters, and then also some compost, like Cedar Grove compost, can have plastic in it, and that's not good for the water, the fish either. So I know it might be too much to ask, but it would be really great if Issaquah could get maybe a digester or something and create their own, or just find some good sources of natural fertilizer. Is that something that could be part of the code?
Definitely. It's going to take more than the code, but I think the code can have best management practices for vegetation management. Especially it becomes more critical in terms of the pesticides and things like that, when there's more danger of things getting into the streams and water courses. So, and Department of Ecology has an oversight on that, Department of Agriculture, you need some sort of permits from them. So we'll have some language in the code related to vegetation management. Absolutely. And so in that, we talked about the best management practices for planting, the soil details. We can certainly incorporate, fertilizer and compost best management practices for that.
Great, and good job with this plan. And then this might be another area. I know I sent an email about the 30-year plan, King County's 30-year plan, and canopy tool. I wonder if King County would have some great references for the urban designs too. Just a thought. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. Very good comments. Next up, we have Dan. Dan, go ahead.
Yeah,
Hi, good evening. Can everybody hear me okay?
Oh, I think, Daniel, that was that for me, Nancy?
Hi. Yeah.
Oh,
Sorry.
I'm sorry.
Multiple Dans here, sorry, yeah.
No problem, I missed that.
Well, this is Dan Hintz speaking with, I guess, a little bit of a question followed by a comment. But Minnie, I'd love to hear just a little bit more about what the standards currently are, or what's being talked about for requirements around species. To me, there could be a pretty simple guideline around, whether, I think most of this are relics, around city, but you still see a lot of landscape species that are, listed noxious weeds, based on King County's noxious weed list. Some that have been recently added, like horse chestnut, black locust, and the obvious ones like holly, laurel, some of the ground covers. I'll just be curious if that's being kind of taken into consideration, or kind of what that species selection kind of process looks like for the landscaping.
Yeah, and again, excellent point. Absolutely. I think we will have the noxious weeds. We'll probably reference the King County noxious weed list because they've done already such great work on that in terms of, if they already have that it's going to take more of a program to kind of, but as new development that comes in and new landscaping that's put in, it becomes that doesn't quite come into play, but the species for their
Okay, Minnie, you're fading in and out. We lost Minnie. So there she is. Try again.
my connection's not that stable today. I don't know what's going on. Hopefully I can continue on. For the new projects where this landscaping code would come into play, obviously we want them to have more diversity of species. We want them to have more, a combination of things. What we tend to see is sometimes the landscape architects tends to use the same sort of palette that they're more comfortable with. They know their plants and things like that. The other thing I think we've heard through the community feedback and through Planning and Policy Commission Park Board's discussions were, having more requirement for drought tolerant species because of climate change issues. How do we incorporate that? So we're looking at those issues to be incorporated.
Anything else, Dan? Okay. With that, we'll move on to Jamie. Jamie, go ahead.
Thanks, Nancy. Jamie speaking. Minnie, I was hoping you could share a little bit, I understand that this update will kind of closely define the starting point. I'm curious about the ongoing process, especially as it relates to aggressive invasives. First of all, what will this portion of the code speak to the level of maintenance required or removal of invasive species, and to what are the enforcement mechanisms / staffing that would go along with that? But yeah, just would love to hear a bit more about that topic.
Yeah, so when you do your plantings and things along the critical areas, we do have current code requirements for monitoring for 5 years and maintaining those for a long period of time. For landscaping that's outside of those critical areas, they have to maintain it in a good, well condition. Otherwise, it becomes a code enforcement issue. So we would generally approach it as, if all your trees are dead, we would approach it as a code enforcement problem and saying you have not maintained your landscaping to the standards you needed to maintain. The bonds and the monitoring aspects, are tools that he could use. If you plant new plantings, generally what we see is contractors have a 1-year warranty or a 2-year warranty, so that's maintained for that period of time. But the longevity of and the well-being of the plantings depends on if they really did those soil amendments when they first planted these things. So I think the approach is to kind of make sure that all that work is done so that the landscaping is thriving. If it is not, then it would be a code enforcement action. In terms of the invasives, certainly I think we can have language in the code to say it is your responsibility to maintain. And I think we all currently have some code related to that that addresses the maintenance aspects.
Thank you, Minnie.
Any other questions or comments on this section for Minnie? Okay, Minnie, I think we've completed this one. I'll let you move on.
Sure. So Daniel, do you want me to share my screen with the presentation, or how do you want to handle that?
No, it's okay.
This is Tom Anderson speaking. I just wanted to jump in. Some technical difficulties at the time here, ended up having to reboot. I was on the phone listening in back, but anyway.
Thanks, Tom, for joining us again.
I'll go ahead and get started. My name is Daniel Martinez. I'm one of the planners with the Community Planning and Development Department. And as Minnie mentioned, I'm going to be the lead staff working on the tree portion of the code. So the city's goal is to conserve and protect existing canopy on a citywide scale. Part of the update is ensuring alignment of tree regulations and trying to ensure no net loss of tree canopy. And one of the numbers at the last meeting that kept coming up was 51%. 51% is the city's current tree canopy based on a study that was completed in 2019. Now, our land use goal in our comprehensive plan is for 50%, which means we are exceeding our goal by 1. Another part of this tree management section of the code is to try and maintain the forested character of the city and retaining its designation as a Tree City USA. I mentioned the tree canopy study. Again, that was done in 2019. Our Parks Department was lead staff for that particular study, and they engaged a consultant. Benefits of a tree canopy is, and just so that we all understand what that is, a tree canopy is the widest distance of a tree's branches from the trunk. Canopy and associated vegetation are critical to stormwater capture and infiltration, shading, providing clean air, and increasing property values of private landowners. Tree canopy can be achieved in several ways, and you'll hear a little bit about how other jurisdictions are doing it and some of our thoughts for incorporating their methods into our code. Currently, we use a tree retention and replacement standards through our Title 18 in the Municipal Code. We have voluntary tree planting on private lots, city-initiated tree planting programs, and environmental stewardship. Today's regulations are largely based on tree retention and tree density. And the purpose of both of those is to protect the environment and preserve the natural forested character, as I mentioned earlier, and enhance the aesthetics of the community. We have 2 different types of designations for the city. We have what's called a significant tree, and that is a tree that is 6 inches diameter in breast height or greater, or 8 inches for a cottonwood or alder. We also have what we call a landmark tree, and that is a tree that is 30 inches or greater in diameter breast height. And some of the opportunities that we are aware of for improving our canopy is to create a citywide cohesive approach to tree management and to strengthen and clarify all aspects of the review, permitting, and approval process for retention and replacement. I mentioned the comprehensive plan and our 50% goal. If you're interested in that, that's land use goal B. Central Issaquah plan also has goals specific to that plan. But that's kind of been one of the challenges, is that we have current regulations that are different for Central Issaquah and different for the rest of the city. And one of the goals is to make sure that we update to just one set of regulations for the entire city. Lake Forest Park is one of the cities that we looked at for canopy preservation. There, canopy cover is measured by the percentage of existing trees and projected canopy coverage to be provided by newly planted trees. We've not sure if you read the memo, but one of the things that we are looking to focus on is to move away from a density approach and to work more towards a retention and replacement approach and really just focus on canopy. Another possibility is to adopt an additional tree type, and that would be a designation for an exceptional tree. Again, Lake Forest Park has this standard, and I understand that one of the things that our code doesn't do is provide a variance process or an exception process for the removal of landmark trees. It's essentially they need to be causing damage or they need to be considered high risk by an arborist. We are considering a variance type process for the removal of landmark trees. So if I'm going to summarize kind of what the gap analysis memo said, we want to make sure that we can establish a separate landscaping and tree preservation code chapters. We want to update the code to include a canopy requirement based on land use. We want to apply a right tree, right place method. So that's location of species and quality will be used to analyze tree retention and replacement. And then finally, we want to strengthen our landmark tree standards, provide a exception process, and then we also want to incorporate standards for exceptional trees. And with that, I'll hand it over for questions and discussion.
Thank you, Daniel, for your presentation. Are there any questions or comments from board members regarding the tree management discussion and landscaping? Tom Anderson, please go ahead.
Yes, Tom Anderson speaking. Am I coming through?
Yes.
Okay, good. I'm wondering, like, how does the city apply this goal to management of parkland? Park might have some open space because they want to have open space there, but we could improve our tree canopy if we planted trees in the middle of Memorial Field, for example. Well, it has two functions. It's a park area that's used for sports, which doesn't need trees. And so maybe you'd want to put trees there to achieve your goals. Now, maybe that's a silly example, Memorial Field, but other parks like Confluence Park, a lot of nice open space. It's very enjoyable the way that it is. But you could achieve a better tree canopy percentage if you planted more trees there. Is that a part of the equation at all? How does that work?
That's not. This is the first time I've heard someone make that suggestion, and so far it has not been part of the conversation. What we do have is we have native growth protection easements, which is a little, it's different. I recognize that it's different than what you're saying, but native growth protection easements are one area in which we designate pieces of land to not be developed and to provide for native vegetation, including large tree canopy.
Well, let me put it this way. Suppose you do the measurement again and it comes out to be 48%. And so, oh my, what should we do? What should we do? Well, the city could do some things about that by planting some more trees on parkland. Or we could just wait until tighten up the regulations on private landowners, and 5 years from now we might get back to 51%. Is that a plausible scenario, or what would we do if it did drop to 48%? I guess is part of the question.
I think I'm going to let Minnie answer that.
Yeah, that is a good question. I think we need to have that part of the conversation in terms of and be realistic about. I mean, yes, we need to set an aspirational goal through our comprehensive plan, through the climate action plan, of what that goal should be. If we want to increase it to whatever that percentage amount is great. And then the hard work is, how do we make that happen? We know wildfire danger issues, you heard from community members today, those are real. What does that mean? We're still trying to understand those. We are at, Issaquah is at the fringe where you have your developed area and you have your forest land. And so the dip in the canopy, if we are going to have some fire breaks and things like that, as we study that issue more, what will that do to the tree canopy, and where will that compensation need to occur? We heard about trees buckling up sidewalks and dying as a result of it because they were the wrong type of tree planted in the wrong place. So what happens when those need to be replaced? You're not going to get a big tree, over, it's going to take a number of years to grow. So I think in the last conversation when we had, the consultant said that the tree canopy isn't going to be the steep curve or a flat curve. They're going to be this jagged curve. So over some years, you might have some temporal loss and you might gain some. And as long as you continue to make progress towards that goal, that's over that time horizon that the community sets itself up for that goal. That'll be important. How we do it, I think the programs, it'll be a combination of things. Where should the trees be planted through the environmental stewardship program from the city? Obviously, near the creeks and the wetlands, there's going to be double benefit because you can shade the trees, the water temperatures will go down. So obviously that should be prioritized. Parkland that the city owns, the parks have a whole process that they go through a community planning exercise. There's a lot of community input into, is the park an active park for sports and other things, or is it a passive park with trails? So all of those things get factored into the park design, but ultimately the park design goes through a public process that then is funded by city council. Yes, it'll be a scramble to find the spaces that we want to plant these trees on, but the goals would be to spread them around so that you can not have heat island impacts and other things, and get some more environmental benefits. But it's a good point. If on a aerial map you see a lot of green space and it's an active sports field, you shouldn't be counting that towards an area that can assume a lot of trees, because that likely won't happen because of programmatic needs. You could plant more along the fringes, and so on and so forth. So, point well taken.
Well, I think there are some opportunities, so we're not going to plant trees on Memorial Field, but like some of the lots that were acquired in the last few years along Issaquah Creek between Front Street and Issaquah Creek there on the west side, there's vacant spaces in there that could have trees. I think that they should be planted, would be my preference, to increase some coverage in there. Well, what is the obstacle to getting, or maybe there's a landscaping plan for those little mini parks that just hasn't been executed yet. I don't know, but I would look to some areas like that. I think that there are opportunities on some of these little parkland areas that are not active parks, but passive parks that could have tree coverage. The other question I have is about the precision of the measurement. Every measurement is perfect, and I'm wondering, well, when we measured at 51, what sort of error can we expect in that? If we measure it each time, do we get 5% different, or 1 or 2%, or what sort of precision should we expect on that measurement?
From the tree canopy study?
Yes.
Yeah, it's a very technical thing. The last time the Parks Department led that effort, and of course, a lot of it is I don't know the answer exactly how precise it is, but it is a tool that a lot of communities are using. It is based on aerial imagery, but the aerial imagery has gotten so good at a lot of these things. I mean, you can narrow it down to the leaf, you know, which tree it is and that kind of stuff. So, but I can't give you a number in terms of it's 100% accurate or it has a margin of plus minus 2%. That would be a question for the experts.
Yeah, well, I wonder about it in terms of this, how close we are to the border, and whether dithering back and forth across the border causes us to change our behavior in any way. Well, understanding that that error would be as part of the policy, but I know there is an error. I know that for sure. Every instrument has an error, so that's something to consider. That's all I had.
Thank you, Tom. I'm going to step in before I call on the next person, and I have a question for you, Minnie. I looked at your approach was to update the code to include canopy requirements based on land use. And my thoughts are, as I look to the city to the west of us, that being Bellevue, and the rapid urbanization that's happening in that city as they take buildings down and put multi-story buildings up, on a case-by-case basis, are we now going to require as buildings, maybe let's call Target, and it goes down and becomes a multi-story, multi-family above type thing, are they going to be required then, since they have to, it's based on the land use code, they have to start providing more of a canopy as, you know, these parking lots become condos with retail on the bottom floor? Are we going to require it on a lot by lot basis in the urban centers? Parcel by parcel basis?
That is my understanding. I'll have Daniel explain the three approaches. I think those three approaches that were laid out in the memo were for if you have 10 trees and you want to cut down one tree, how do we look at whether you meet your canopy coverage goals or not? So right now, you know, if you own a residential lot, you need a tree density, a minimum tree density of some trees, and 4 trees per 5,000 square feet. Correct me if I'm wrong, Daniel, but I think something like that. So there is a tree density requirement, and it's just number of trees divided by the per square feet of the lot area. The approach I think that's laid out and that we're considering doing is, instead of really a numbers game, it's more about what's the quality and the canopy coverage of that existing tree that you want to take down. So if it is 10 inches wide and it is an evergreen tree with this large canopy coverage, the arborist will determine what your canopy coverage is, and you have to replace it by planting other trees that meet the canopy coverage. I will let Daniel explain if I have kind of misspoken on the approach.
No, that was correct. And the example you gave was also accurate. So for commercial areas, for example, we require a minimum of 4 significant trees for every 5,000 square feet. And so if you're developing a property right now, you have to meet both retention, and that could be 30%. So you can't cut down more than 30% of the trees that are existing. And then when you are developing a property, you have to also meet density, meaning that if you have a 10,000 square foot lot that you're developing in your commercial building, you have to provide a minimum of 8 trees.
I guess that. Sorry.
Say that again.
I guess it concerns me then how we structure the exceptions, because in the commercial core, if they redevelop to a higher density, and they usually have trees in their parking lot already because of the landscaping strips or future or previous codes, it is going to be very challenging for them to do this, and they're always going to be asking for exceptions or exemptions or something to get them around these requirements. And how do we have the teeth and the wherewithal to stand up so that that doesn't occur, so that we're actually getting the canopy that we're trying to get out of this? I mean, I'm concerned about that because I can see it very easily happening.
Yeah, so a couple of things there, Chair. I mean, I think the retention requirements would apply. So if there's a parking lot, we all know those parking lots right now really barely have any trees, but if it was a really nicely planted parking lot, they would have to preserve 30% of those trees for the tree retention. We can kind of look at what that retention number needs to be with this update. We could require larger percentage, for retention. But then you get into those competing priorities, right? So if you want people living close by and not having a car-centric city where people can walk to and have all of that, so redevelopment of a surface parking lot is a good thing in that respect, because otherwise, 500 stall parking lot is not necessarily meeting that vision. So I think there's going to be some of those competing things that will come into play. But as far as the tree regulations and the landscaping regulations come into play, I think you bring up a good point. What does that mean for redevelopment? The tree retention requirements for redevelopment versus an undeveloped site perhaps needs to be nuanced out in the code.
Thank you. That covers my question. Sorry to interrupt with you guys. I think we have Ann Newcomb coming up next. Thanks, Ann.
Yeah, thank you, Nancy. Ann here. So yeah, I liked Tom's idea of looking at the parks, especially the ones near the creeks, like Confluence Park and Bernstein Park, and thinking about, do we need all of this grass, or could we plant some more trees to increase our tree canopy? And as we are looking at the tree canopy, I liked Ann Fletcher's idea of putting in the verbiage about carbon sequestration. So it's good to remember that 50% of a tree is carbon. It's of course it also goes into the soil, but that's something to look at as we're looking at the tree canopy, which trees sequester more carbon. And then I'm going to plug the King County 30-year forest plan again, because they have a lot of great ideas. I think it's going to be an interesting dance as we go forward, having a lot of trees and climate change and fire. I just got back from Paradise, California. I was down there. That's where the campfire was. I was down there for my aunt's 90th birthday party. They had a lot of restrictions on cutting trees down in their codes. It just started making me think about ours, but I don't think we're anything like them in California, and we're very practical with our trees, and we're also looking at forest health and the native undergrowth. And we're in the Pacific Northwest, which is not so hot and dry, and hopefully we will never get that way. But Kathleen Wolf and the other scientists did a great job with the 30-year forest health plan for King County. And they did also look at, what vegetation and trees might we start thinking about that are farther south, like in the Pacific Northwest, but in Oregon, not as far south as California, but in Oregon. How might that work better for the future? And so I'm wondering if you're looking at stuff like that, Daniel.
We have not, but
Okay.
part of this having this conversation is to elicit these comments and these questions so that we can look at those things more closely.
Awesome. And thank you.
And I do have an answer to Tom's earlier question. I took a look, and the margin of error is 3.5%, meaning that the range is 47.7% to 54.7% of tree canopy.
Thank you for that, Daniel. Okay, Dan Hintz, you're up next.
All right, thanks, Nancy. Dan Hintz. I guess I have two questions, or one being a clarification and hopefully a few comments I can make pretty quickly here. I do just want to be clear. Minnie, you might have described this. I just want to be clear on the retention rate. I thought Daniel mentioned it's only a 30% loss, or is it a 30% retention of trees on sites? And also, how is that defined? Is that based on DBH, or is there selection for certain quality of trees too on that? I would just like to hear a little bit more on the retention part of it.
I know you directed it at Minnie. I'm happy to
sure.
Answer. So it's different based on, I mentioned earlier that we have different standards for Central Issaquah and then the rest of the city. And so if we're talking about Issaquah at large, for single family duplex and short plats, you're looking at 30% total DBH of significant trees in the developable site area. So you're taking out trees. You're not counting trees that are in critical areas if the site is encumbered by critical areas. And as to your question about quality or species, we don't have any standards for that. I think quality is something that's come up a few times, and I think that is something that we could pursue. I understand that a cottonwood or an alder may not have the same value to some folks or to the environment as another species. So that's something that we could potentially pursue.
Awesome. Well, Daniel, that's perfect, because I think you kind of got at my second question. I was trying to remember from one of our earlier meetings about overlap with critical areas, whether that be stream buffers, wetland buffers. So I just wanted to be clear on that. I thought that's the case. You actually answered my second question there. So I guess my comments are, I think there's a big range between a significant tree at 6-inch diameter and a landmark tree at 30-inch diameter. So I think there could be some nuance, and unfortunately, I think, yes, there's some trees that I personally wouldn't consider that significant at 6 to 8 inch diameter. Talking about, I think 8 inch you said for alders, cottonwoods, but I think there could be some nuance there based on species or even some kind of intermediate thresholds on DBH. Personally, I think 30% retention is pretty low for some of these sites. So I don't know if that's something that could be considered bumping that up. So those are just a couple of comments kind of on the answer I got from Daniel there, which is great. Looking through the memo, a few comments I just want to make quickly here. Specifically, I really like the emphasis on species selection and retention and replacement of native conifers. So I just want to kind of amplify that in the memo there. And I appreciate how it's called out. They provide more ecological functions. They're more long-lived. And I'd even advocate for as best as possible native species, but we have some really good species like our Cedrus atlantica, some European pine species that actually do really well in kind of hot drought or even kind of more pollution roadside areas. So I think there's a lot of flexibility there, but obviously our conifers are serving rain interception, stormwater, those benefits year round versus our deciduous trees that obviously drop leaves. So really like that. I really am kind of interested in maybe learning a little bit more. I guess I'll just kind of also amplify strengthening some of the arborist qualifications and expertise. I will say personally, from my experience, I feel a little frustrated, and sometimes I think there's kind of a clear bias of tree removal for arborist companies that are both doing the risk assessment and potentially the removal. There's an incentive for them to take out trees and easily kind of convince landowners that yes, this could be a hazard to your roof, car, whatever. And I don't want to say that doesn't exist, but I do feel like often there is an incentive to remove trees that arborists put out on people. And I would be really curious to see what kind of more rigorous qualifications would look like for that, and also, how the city arborist. I actually didn't know City of Issaquah has a designated arborist and kind of what their role serves in some of these conversations around tree removal. So just want to kind of comment on that. And then my last comment is on the in lieu city tree fund. I've been trying to read a little bit and found mixed things on the trunk formula method. I will just say, yeah, I mean, of course, if it's a small tree and you can replace the similar size at a nursery, I just don't see that being a actual tangible thing for most of our tree loss. You're replacing trees that we're talking for conifers 2 decades to become a significant tree at 6 to 8 inches diameter at breast height. So I don't know if the trunk, sorry, one more time. I believe the trunk formula method really counts that kind of temporal loss. I feel like Minnie brought that up a little bit. We talk about that a lot for wetlands and wetland mitigation. We're removing something, replanting it, which is great, but we're talking decades. We're talking a human lifetime before they become, landmark trees as that designation. So I really think there could be more analysis and even more justification around higher values for tree replacement. So
Yes.
yes. So that's a comment I have there. So that we're talking decades, lifetimes replacement there. I think, not sure who was echoing me there. Maybe that was Connie. But and then the last thing, this is something I'm pretty sure is in our code, but I have a hard time talking about tree canopy and all this stuff without also talking about impervious surfaces. So when we're talking about some of these urban developments in these areas, when we pave over areas, we can unpave them. I know that, but I see no evidence of that happening in cities, Issaquah, elsewhere. It just ties so dramatically to the health of our vegetation, health of our stormwater streams, fish. So I know maybe that's a different conversation, obviously a different part of the land use code, but I have a hard time not combining tree canopy and also talking about impervious surfaces and some of the really high density areas we have there. So the kind of more equal distribution of forest can be really limited by some of those kind of densely paved areas. So, okay. I'm sorry, that was pretty long, but I will leave it at that.
Dan, I don't know if I agree. I actually think impervious surface and tree are totally related. If we have a 95% maximum allowable impervious surface, that's clearly not going to allow for the kind of tree canopy that the city is looking for.
Oh, I think that's what I was saying. Sorry.
Yeah. No.
You do. Okay, you do. Okay, sorry. Yeah. So I don't know what some of the regulations around that, but I think those are very connected.
I agree they're connected, and I don't know, and I think that there's an opportunity there to look at what are the impervious surface ratios, and if we have those impervious surface ratios, are we going to actually achieve the tree canopy that we want?
Yeah, awesome.
Going back to your previous comment about 30% being low, 30% is for single family designations and duplexes. It's actually 25% for commercial and multifamily developments, and it's 25% through Central Issaquah. And because Connie is on the call and I see her hand up, I'm going to get ahead of this a little bit and also mention that in Central Issaquah, you can, if you are a developer and you come in with an application, you can request to go down to 0 tree retention per our current code. So that's something else that I know we probably should look at.
Great. Thanks for the feedback, Daniel, and great comments, Dan. Moving on to Jamie. Jamie Finch, go ahead.
Thanks, Nancy. Jamie speaking. Daniel, I was wondering, I just want to make sure that I understand the differences between the current approach and the proposed updated approach. So I was wondering if you could walk us through a hypothetical, like say what you could choose, but maybe a fully forested lot that was covered with 100 significant trees. How would that differ in this current, like what we use today versus what, and percentages, I know setting aside percentages that I know those are going to be defined, but I would love to hear just the parameters that developer would be subject to under the current approach, and then what is being proposed.
Sure. So I can kind of tell you what it would look like under current code. We don't, because we have several ideas on the table about future approach, that it's not really possible for me to just pick one and run with it, because it's entirely possible that we're going to have a combination of approaches. Currently, you mentioned if you have a completely forested site and you have 100 trees, we wouldn't necessarily look at the number of trees. We would look at the total caliper inches for all of the trees combined. So if those 100 trees come out to 1,000 caliper inches, you are, and you're building a single family development in, under the municipal code, then you're required to retain 300 inches of caliper of trees. And that could end up being 6 50-inch trees, but that's what the code says today.
Okay, and the tree canopy approach that you would have to retain 30% of the tree. I just want to make sure I understand the difference between, and that's, I think, the proposed approach, right? And I'm sure there's some nuance down the road, but that's our current approach.
That's our current approach, is caliper inches retained.
Yeah, so what I was talking about was the proposed approach, which I believe is a tree canopy based look at how we would calculate tree density. Is that correct?
So like I said, there are a couple of potential ways to look at it. One of them is a cost approach to tree valuation. And another one is a trunk formula method that Dan talked about. And to be completely honest, because I don't want to try and make it up on the fly, I'm not familiar enough with the application of those or the implementation of those to be able to truly walk you through that in a logical way.
Okay. So there was those 3 different options around calculation of tree density. How are those applied to this update? And this might get back to Minnie's original point around goals versus code versus. But I'm just trying to understand how those 3 options that were brought up in the update or in the memo, how those apply, how we're supposed to think about applying that.
I'm trying to pull up the memo here. I think what you're getting at is in the memo we talked about the canopy approach is, hang on, just quickly get to that. So let me share my screen and pull that up here real quick so we can all look at what said in there. So let's see if I can share. Can you all see my screen?
Yes.
So I think what Commissioner Finch is talking about is this piece right? Develop citywide tree retention based on canopy cover goals by land use type and lot size.
The place that it specifically references is a bit higher up. It's under tree density determination methods. It's, at least on mine on page 18.
Yep. So down here we said the third methodology is the canopy-based approach. This approach identifies canopy coverage goals for lot sizes and land use types. And then I think the idea under this approach is to measure the percentage of the canopy provided by the existing trees, and then look at the projected canopy provided by the newly planted trees. So if you take one tree out and you obviously can figure out what the canopy is of that tree, but the new tree that you're going to plant or new trees that you're going to plant, you have to project what the canopy of that tree is going to be. Obviously, it's going to depend on, is it well maintained? Does it grow up to be the right size tree and all that? So when they reach the maturity is sort of, but in order to figure that out, it'll have to be done by someone that knows a lot about trees and certified arborist and all that. So what this would do is it would avoid the scenario that Daniel was explaining. Under the current methodology, you cumulatively count the diameter of all the trees, and then you have to preserve 30%, which could only mean you clear cut the whole thing and you're left with 3 trees standing that are the larger trees, but they're in the corner. So you've kind of lost that tree canopy spread out throughout the lot. Under this approach, it's not a numbers game. It's more about the canopy coverage for those trees. So I think that it avoids some of those pitfalls of the existing code.
Okay, thanks. And so with that, then, if we were to go, that's the proposed approach by the city, correct? If
Yes.
we were to go that approach, let's say that the retention 30% for single family stayed the same, that would mean that they would need to retain 30% of the tree cover or the canopy cover. That would then be the metric for calculating what how that 30% is defined.
For retention, and then for replacement, if you then it would come out, okay, you've taken down, you have to retain these many based on the canopy calculations. Then for the ones that you took out, there may be some replacement ratios for those, and those replacement ratios are again going to be based off of what the canopy of this tree that you're planting today will be in 30 years and will meet that canopy coverage objective in the long run. So both for retention and for replacement is my understanding that how this would work.
Okay.
But again, those details haven't been fleshed out. I mean, as we start, at this point, we're saying, is this the right kind of, big picture idea to pursue? And then we'll work out all the details and share the code, first draft with you all.
Yeah, I just want to make sure that I understood the distinction, which this seems like a fairly significant distinction between like caliber inches versus canopy being the key metric that would define retention, like that would be used in, okay. Thank you, Minnie, that's helpful. And then I know there was some mention of the 30-year aspect, like would that factor in the basically guessed at canopy at 30 years? Is that going to be factored into that only is that in the retention piece of it, or is that in some other aspect of how that would be applied?
In the replacement.
In the replacement, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. And I think my last question, and this is more of a comment, I guess, would be based on that. I am curious what the replacement levels are going to be, because presumably if we're trying to basically maintain our tree canopy today, like we're basically at our goal for maintaining tree canopy. And if there's, let's say everyone only retains 30% on the lots that are developed, that assumes some net loss from that. So I'm just curious, that really seems like a really important aspect of like, and I don't remember seeing any detail around what that would look like, what those ratios would look like. But that seems like a really important topic, because if we're planning on trying to retain tree canopy, that seems like the only mechanism to actually do that. Because otherwise, every developed property is going to result in net loss, and we're going to slowly chip away at any buffer that we have for that goal. So that's a part of this. I assume that's in scope for this update. Is that correct?
Correct. And so the replacement ratios are going to be a lot larger. And then if you we talked about the fee in lieu of, obviously we don't want someone clear cutting the whole lot, asking for deviations and then just paying the money in lieu of that. But in circumstances where they meet the retention requirements, they have to meet this canopy coverage goals, but they can't plant on their property. In that case, we want some of that planting to occur in a location, somewhere else, off site or whatever, but an actual tree gets planted for that replacement. So I think all of those details will be part of that replacement ratio. I think, I don't know if you have anything to add, Daniel, on the replacement. Are we further along on how the replacement will look like?
No, so my understanding, and this is also in the memo, Commissioner Finch, if you go to page 20 of the packet, the memo does a pretty good job of outlining how retention and replacement would work together. So if a developer is going to retain only 30%. So it sounds like we're going to be doing away with caliper inches, and it sounds like we're going to be doing away with minimum density. And instead, we're going to have this canopy that we're looking at. So that table on page 20 kind of provides for the different land use types and lot sizes and what the canopy goal is. And that's where that 30-year mark comes in, is it's a combination of retention and replacement. And replacement is going to be, you are achieving if it's a single family residential lot greater than 15,000 square feet, your canopy cover goal is 60 to 70%. So we would be looking at replacement trees and looking forward into the future in 30 years, is it going to be feasible for that lot to achieve canopy goal of 60 to 70%? One point of clarification to make is that we don't currently have a city arborist on staff. It's city arborist is mentioned in code, but we don't currently have one. So I think that's going to be a discussion for decision makers to make, whether they want to keep that in code and actually have that position as an FTE, or whether we want to take that out and rely on consultants.
Quick question on what you just said. So am I correct that, let's say they took it down to 30% retention, regardless of how it's calculated, then if it's a single family residential that's, let's say it's under 10,000 feet, they would not really have much mitigation or like replacement to do, because if they're getting to the goal, they're basically already at that goal. Is that an accurate way to think about that? I'm just not clear how these canopy apply to a replacement.
So you're looking at 25 to 35%. Is that lots less than 10,000 square feet? So if you go down to 30%, then you could, based on this, you could say that they already meet their goal.
Okay. And I know I've been going on for a while, so I'm going to wrap this up really quick. But I do think that this is a little bit concerning in my mind, because it seems like this table will not, especially because if someone has taken 70% off of their current property that are trees today that are covering 70% and replanting, let's say they did have to replant 5%, that is going to be that 5% in 30 years. That seems like not a very good trade. So I do wonder, and hopefully I'm understanding this correctly, this seems like a really important part of this update. And if we're serious about retaining canopy, these goals don't seem aggressive enough to do that. But maybe I'm missing something, but that seems, based on what we just walked through, that seems to be how I'm reading this. Is it seems like those goals are not aggressive enough.
Yeah, and part of it could be that, as I mentioned earlier, I'm not super familiar with the application of this in a real world setting. So I'm happy to talk to the consultant, try and understand it a little bit more, and then provide follow up and some sort of real world example at another time.
Yeah, and
Thanks,
there's the
Daniel.
opportunity to look at these percentages, as we do the draft code writing. Typically in a single family home that's less than 10,000 square feet, an average home has a built-in, a house, has a driveway, has a patio, and then how much area is left around it will have landscaping plus trees. So 25 to 30%, and on an average, I think what the consultant did here was they looked at what the existing canopy coverage were for these different uses based on the study that was done, and established these percentages based on what's there on the ground now. But certainly more detail and more analysis needs to be done.
Yeah, I do wonder, is the right way to is it based on the current developed environment, or is it the existing plots of that zoning type? What is the makeup of those? I'm guessing a lot of the existing developable land is up on hillsides that's fully forested. That might not be the same as what our average single family home is today because of some of these. I just wonder, are we backing into the wrong answer by looking at what's out there today? Thank you.
Good point.
Thanks, Jamie. Great feedback at this point. Tom, I'm going to jump over you and go to Janet since we have not heard from her yet. Janet, please go ahead. Janet Wall.
This is Janet Wall. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. At least 10 years ago, probably more, there was a big volunteer effort to remove the ivy on the trees along Issaquah Creek in the Squawk Access Trail area. Since then, the ivy has grown back, possibly endangering the trees by weakening them and making them more vulnerable to being blown down. Maintenance is needed to protect these trees. Obviously, the current regulations are not working in that regard. Can there be something that would strengthen the regulations? I'm not sure exactly who owns the property that the trees are on, but they're right along the Issaquah Creek.
Do you want me to respond, Daniel? So, yes, I think the code can provide some language in terms of long-term maintenance. It can have some more teeth for if you don't do the maintenance, then these are the penalties. Or if you take down these trees illegally, these are the penalties. I mean, all of that enforcement mechanisms can be strengthened and made harsher and stronger. In terms of whether the property owner ultimately will be responsible for this, it's going to take more than the code to kind of make a big difference on the ground. That's where I think we talked about there's the code, there's the environmental stewardship program from the city, there is the educational opportunities to kind of raise awareness, there's showing people how to do this easily, how to remove IV, and what are best ways to do it. So it's going to take a combination of things, but the code itself, yes, we can add some more language and strengthen the code as for maintenance requirement and what the penalties are if you don't maintain. I think that can be considered in the code update.
Good. Thank you.
Janet, is that it?
Yes, it was one of my concerns is I see a number of places where there are a lot of invasive plants along creeks that can create a problem with the canopy cover. And I would like to see better maintenance and to maintain the trees that we have that are already shading the creek.
Okay. Tom, you had something else to add. Tom Anderson, please.
Yeah, this is Tom Anderson speaking. This may be a bit off the wall, but I'm wondering, are you aware of any jurisdictions that have tried things like having an incentive to a property owner for increasing their canopy cover? So I'm thinking about things like, well, we'll give you a reduced storm sewer rate. You have greater than a certain percentage, or you've improved your coverage. Is this been tried anywhere?
An excellent point. You know, in any regulation, there's the incentives and the carrots and the sticks approach. So the incentives work for people, you know, especially for the development side. They only work if they're financially really an incentive. Otherwise, we have incentives to, you know, you get extra height if you provide affordable housing. How many people actually take up on that? So the economics then come into play about if those incentives really have to work. So the penalty of if you cut these extra down, you really the cost of the tree replacement, the fee in lieu could be really high. So both approaches can be looked at, but you know we're happy to do more research on the incentives idea, and I think that's an excellent idea to see, not only from a requirement standpoint, but also seeing if we can sprinkle some incentives throughout this.
Yeah, well, I'm thinking of not the development event, because the city has a big stick over a developer and levy all kinds of fees, etc. But okay, I'm a property owner and I've got my little lot here, and I've got to pay this storm sewer bill every month. But I'm right on the edge here. If I just added a few more trees, I'd be up to 60% and I'd get a lower rate. Well, the storm sewer rate is so low that there isn't much incentive there, but it could be higher. You know, okay, we could use this as a method to make it a real incentive, up that rate for the people who have a low canopy coverage, and provide some meaningful advantages to planting trees on property owners' lots. So I don't know,
Yeah,
just a
no,
wild and crazy idea, but
no, it's a great idea. Um, in terms of it, you know, it may probably not live in the code, but you're bringing up a policy standpoint, you know, policy discussion for the city. And I'm not familiar with our stormwater rates over here, but a lot of cities have them based on the percentage of impervious surface you have. The more impervious surface you have, the higher your rates are. And I don't know if that's the case with Issaquah or not. But we can certainly take that as a policy discussion when the stormwater surface water plan is being discussed, to have some policies that incentivize people to have less impervious surface and more trees planted within those areas.
yeah, well, that's good. And so it should be not just impervious surface, but canopy cover.
Yeah.
Well, perhaps. Um, Let's see, I guess this causes me to think of another question like, well, okay, the city has done this measurement and will periodically do it. Is it possible for a particular lot owner to get the answer for their particular lot from that study? Or will the city, I guess another way to look at that, will the city use that measurement as the basis for the before coverage on a lot that's to be developed? And then feed that into, okay, you're going to cut all these trees down, therefore here's the resulting coverage. Is that how that'll be used on a per lot basis, or is that like something a developer would have to do a separate assessment, a separate measurement for a particular lot as it goes into a development project?
Yeah, if I understand your question correctly, you're wondering about how the tree canopy study that's done at a citywide be used by developers on a parcel-based size. So my understanding is that will probably not work. The idea of the tree canopy study is to really look at everything comprehensively and cumulatively. So it looks at that. But for each development, it's a much more fine-grained information we need. We need a survey of where the trees are, what their sizes are. So we get a lot more detailed information with the development application. So.
Okay, thank you. That's all I had.
Okay, folks. Thank you all for your great feedback. I think that it's been very constructive, and we've provided some good feedback to the city. At this point, Minnie, I'm going to turn you over for the next section of this.
Sure. So the last section we wanted to share with you was really this open space requirements, and we're still sort of the main thing we want to capture in that is all that work that was done for the parks and open space park strategic plan that identified these are the linkages we want, these are the green necklace connected open spaces and green spaces we desire for this community. How do we make sure that in the code and as redevelopment occurs, that vision can be achieved? Now, obviously, I think we are coordinating very closely with our Parks Department and in terms of what really makes sense for at the time of development. It's much more easier to get a trail connection that is identified on a map. It's much more easier to get, here's the Mountains to Sun Greenway, corridor. And if you're doing development right on this corridor, your frontage needs to look like this. And I think probably not your group, but we've toured some of the sites in Issaquah where there was recent redevelopment. So Riva Townhomes up on Newport, that was identified as a corridor. So what does that frontage look like? How wide the sidewalk needs to be? What kind of trees need to be planted up there? So all of that needs to be closely coordinated between the code requirements and what the vision under the park strategic plan is. Now, where it gets tricky is obviously, if you get a residential development, we will have an open space requirement that says you need X square feet per unit, and you need to have this as a rooftop unit, as a ground floor open space. Some of this can be counted by your balconies. All of that private open space for that development standard. So developer built, developer maintained for the people that are going to be using it are on that site. Then we have, in some cases, where the example I gave you, a trail connection or a Mountains to Sun Greenway connection, those need to be open for any community member. So those will be built by the developer, but they'll get turned over to the city for maintenance and will be open for all community use. And then, of course, the vision for, as part of the park strategic plan, includes these larger parks and things that probably won't happen on a parcel by parcel basis, but those will be the capital improvements that the city will need to do and fund through some of those park acquisitions, land acquisitions, and park planning development, stages. So there's various tiered approach to that. Currently, Issaquah, we have fractured codes that apply. Some apply in the central Issaquah area, others in the municipal code have a different criteria. Some of the developments that occurred, Talus and Issaquah Highlands, had a whole thing that was negotiated through the development agreement of what the park and open spaces need to be. So part of our approach is going to be to take a comprehensive look at all of those, take a look at this comprehensive plan or the park strategic plan, and identify opportunities for these standards for different tiers of spaces. The hardest one is where the developer builds, turns it over to the city, and what that looks like. It's much easier to get that accomplished through trail connections or the long corridor connections, but getting a full park built as part of a private development is a challenge. I think the code currently has, you will get a credit for your park impact fees. It becomes a nightmare to implement what that credit is going to be. It's on a case by case basis. So that falls in this park impact fee discussion. So right now, the city has an established park impact fees that come into play if you're doing a different type of a use. There are different rates for different type of uses depending on the usage. Some of the things we are considering is these open space requirements perhaps should factor in if you are within a 10-minute walking distance of a park. It probably has a different standard for how much open space you need versus if you're far away from, so there's some sort of an equitable distribution. But it's all, at a very preliminary stage. So we're, we welcome any and all comments on this issue of how do we take that vision for the Parks and Open Space strategic plan and make that, fold that into code requirements, understanding that code will give you a limited, vision. We don't want to preclude you from getting that vision by allowing a building or a development where there is a future connection for a trail and things like that. So removing the barriers for a future connection, getting the connection as part of the development, all of that, I think, needs to have some ground truthing of what's really achievable through the implementation of the code and what's an aspirational thing in the code that we may never get because it'll get negotiated through this park impact fee credit and all that. So is it better for the city to have a more consistent and a fair approach to just say you have to pay your park impact fee and then you provide these trail connections and leave it at that? So that's where we're at. I think it's very preliminary discussions we're having with the parks. We, as I think some community member mentioned, we did have this discussion with the Park Planning and Policy Commission and the Parks Board together. We do intend to continue this conversation with the Parks Board on the 24th, I believe, this coming Monday, or the 25th, whenever their next meeting is. We will have some more facilitated conversation with them about the vision in the park strategic plan. I think that's all we have on this topic for now.
Thank you, Minnie. Are there any comments or questions for Minnie? Excuse me, Minnie. I'm not seeing any at this time. So I guess that concludes that conversation piece. I need to go back and find the agenda, sorry. Any other comments in general on all of the work that has been presented by the by Minnie and her staff? I've lost the agenda, sorry. Jean, I think you're now presenting what is happening within the city for that applies to the environmental board, upcoming meetings, things like that.
Sure. I have 3 quick updates for reports tonight. The first is on the community convening on climate. So that meeting is scheduled for next Wednesday, October 20th at 6:30. And right now we have 4 board members who've indicated a desire to attend. Those members are Jamie Finch, Danny Madden, Janet Wall, and Ann Newcomb. So because we have 4, we're right at the limit for forming of a quorum. So kind of the request from the administration is that no more board members decide at the last minute to join that meeting and inadvertently form a quorum. So those 4 are good to attend, but please no more for that meeting tomorrow or next week rather. The next item is the next meeting for the environmental boards. That's scheduled for November 10th. The agenda for that meeting includes voting on the final recommendations for the climate action plan and also a discussion and input on the storm and surface water master plan. And then the last update is just on the hiring process for the new sustainability manager. The city closed the last round of applications on October 1st. I believe there'll be interviews at the end of next week, and the hope is that a staff member will be on board by the beginning of December. But in the interim, I'm expecting to help support the board for the November meeting, and hopefully we'll have better news on a full-time staff member filling that role soon.
Great. Thank you, Jean. Are there any other comments or business or announcements from the board members or other participants in the meeting? Anne, go ahead.
I just have a question for Minnie. Will these codes override the HOA rules? It seems like the HOAs sometimes get in the way of having good environmental guidelines.
Yeah, so we don't necessarily get to see all the HOA rules, but we can enforce the code, the city adopted code. So part of the conversation, I think, with HOAs would be once the code is adopted to share what the new regulations are, so they can be consistent. So there can be some work done in terms of reaching out to the HOAs and sharing what the rules and regulations are that are adopted, and so they can avoid the conflict. We don't enforce, I mean, the city cannot enforce HOA rules, but we can enforce the adopted municipal code.
Great, thank you.
Great. Jamie, you had a comment?
Thanks, Nancy. Jamie speaking. I just wanted to give everyone a little bit of insight into a task force that actually Mayor Pauley formed to help us identify, setting aside the CIP, what's in the specific projects that we've set aside funding for. We have a long list of items that are not funded at this time. And Mayor Pauley has formed a task force that is really looking at, okay, of those projects, which buckets do we want to prioritize and how might we go about funding those? And Nancy actually was nice enough to allow me to join that task force. And so that's something that we're now a couple meetings in. It's still very early, but I just wanted to give everyone insight into that's something that's going on. I don't really have a ton to share at this point, but that's something that we'll continue to develop throughout this year, and we'll get more detail on and we'll share as anything relevant comes up.
Thanks, Jamie. Any other comments or questions? Seeing none, at this point, I'm going to adjourn the meeting. Thank you all for all your time and great feedback to the city, and look forward to seeing you in November. Take care. Bye.